"You never talk to your father that way in my house," my daughter shouted from the kitchen, and my son-in-law just stood there with his coffee, not saying a word. I was holding the porch railing at 6 in the morning, waiting for the pain in my knee to settle enough that I could make it down the last 3 steps without my leg buckling. 4 days earlier, I'd had a fall in the shower and cracked something in my kneecap, and the doctor had put me in a brace and told me not to push it. I hadn't asked for pity. I'd only asked for a ride to physical therapy, and that had apparently been the wrong thing to ask, because my daughter had a client call, and my son-in-law had a tea time, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the man I'd known for 11 years looked at me and said I was starting to feel like a full-time job. I didn't answer him. I went back inside, packed the one suitcase I'd brought when I moved in, and by noon, I was in a taxi heading to a motel outside of town. That should have been the end of it. A quiet, humiliating chapter in an old man's life. It wasn't. 9 days later, my son-in-law opened his front door to a woman holding a folder, and by the time she left, he was sitting on his own porch steps, with his head in his hands, because the folder had my late wife's name on it, and it changed everything he thought he understood about where his money had been coming from for the last 6 years. Before I go any further, I want to say thank you for being here with me. If you're watching this, drop a word and tell me what state you're calling in from tonight, because it means something to sit here and know there's someone on the other end listening. A small note before we start. This story carries some fictional details shaped for the telling, but the heart of it, I think, is true for more families than anyone likes to admit. My name is Walter Reeves. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years I ran a small commercial printing business out of a warehouse in Dayton, Ohio. The kind of place where you learn every machine by the sound it makes when something's about to go wrong. I built that business from a single second-hand press and a loan my father co-signed against his own better judgment, and I sold it 4 years ago to a regional printing company for enough money that I thought I'd never have to worry about anything again. My wife, Carol, had passed 18 months before the sale, breast cancer that came back a second time, and didn't leave anything behind but her garden, and I sold the business because there didn't seem to be much point running it without her to come home and tell about the day. I moved in with my daughter Denise and her husband Craig about a year after that, not because I couldn't afford my own place, but because the house Carol and I had shared felt too big and too quiet, and Denise had said, "Come stay with us, Dad. We've got the room, and it'll be good for the kids to have you around." I believed her. I still think she believed it too, at the time. The knee injury happened on a Tuesday. I'd gotten up in the night for water, misjudged the step down into the bathroom, and gone down hard enough that I heard something in my leg make a sound I didn't like. Denise drove me to urgent care herself that morning, and for about 2 weeks, she was the daughter I remembered, checking in on me, bringing up ice packs, asking if I needed anything. Then the 2 weeks turned into 6, and 6 turned into a pattern where every trip to physical therapy became a negotiation. Every request for a ride became something I had to apologize in advance for making. Craig had never been unkind to me, exactly. Not before that morning on the porch. He'd been indifferent in a way I told myself was just his personality, a man who kept to himself and didn't say much at the dinner table. I told myself that for a long time, because the alternative, that I had become an inconvenience in my own daughter's house, was harder to sit with. The morning it happened, I'd asked Denise the night before if she could take me to my 9 a.m. appointment, and she said she'd try to move her call. I woke up early, showered carefully, got myself dressed, and came downstairs to find her already, on the phone, in the kitchen, with her laptop open, and Craig standing at the counter in his golf clothes, checking his phone. I said, "Good morning." Craig didn't look up. I asked, as gently as I could, whether the ride was still on, because my appointment was in 40 minutes, and the therapist charged for missed sessions. Denise put her hand over the phone and said, "Not now, Dad. I'm on with a client. Can you just call a cab?" I said, "That was fine. I could do that. I just wanted to know so I could plan." Craig set his phone down then and said, low enough that he probably thought I wouldn't hear it clearly, but I did. He said, "This is what I mean. It's every single day with something." Denise ended her call a minute later and rounded on him, right there in front of me, telling him he didn't get to talk about her father that way in her own house. Craig didn't apologize. He picked up his golf bag from the mudroom and said he'd talk to her later, and he walked out the door like nothing at all unusual had happened. Denise stood there for a second, her face doing something complicated, somewhere between embarrassment and exhaustion. And then she looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Dad. He doesn't mean it. He's just stressed." I said, "I know, sweetheart. I didn't mean it as agreement. I meant it the way you say something to end a conversation you don't have the strength to finish." I went upstairs to the guest room, the room that used to be Denise's when she was in high school, still faintly patterned with the outline of where old posters had once hung, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, not thinking about the appointment I was going to miss, but about a full-time job. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a father in that house and started being a line item, a problem to be managed around a golf schedule. I thought about Carol, about the year before she died, when she'd said to me one night, out of nowhere, "Promise me you won't let yourself become something people just tolerate." I'd laughed it off at the time. I didn't laugh thinking about it now. I packed the suitcase the same way I'd unpacked it a year earlier, careful and quiet, and I left a note on the kitchen counter instead of waiting to have a conversation I already knew wouldn't go anywhere useful. The note said, "I don't want to be in the way anymore. I'll call when I'm settled." I took a cab to a Best Western off the interstate, checked in under my own name with my own card, and sat on the edge of a motel bed with my knee brace still on, feeling, for the first time since Carol died, entirely and completely alone. Denise called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. She called 4 more times over the next 2 days, and I finally picked up on the 5th call because I didn't want her calling the police out of guilt and making a bigger mess of things. She was crying, saying she'd talked to Craig, that he felt terrible, that I should come back, that this was all a misunderstanding. I told her I needed some time, that I wasn't angry, just tired, and that I'd be in touch. That part was true. What I didn't tell her, because I hadn't fully worked it out myself yet, was that somewhere in that motel room, lying awake at 2 in the morning with my knee throbbing under the brace, I had started thinking clearly for the first time in over a year about the money. Here is the part of the story I need to explain carefully, because it matters for everything that comes after. When I sold the printing business 4 years ago, I didn't just walk away with a lump sum and call it done. On the advice of an old friend from the Rotary Club who happened to be a financial planner, I'd set most of it into a structured trust with a smaller operating account for day-to-day expenses. Denise knew about the operating account. She'd helped me set up online banking on it 2 years ago, back when I was still learning how to use my phone for anything beyond phone calls, and in the process of helping me, she'd become a joint signer on that account, which had seemed sensible at the time, a convenience in case something happened to me and she needed to pay a bill. What Denise did not know, because I had never told her, and because Carol and I had set it up together before she got sick, back when we were just 2 people in our 50s thinking sensibly about the future, was that the bulk of the money, nearly $600,000, sat in an irrevocable trust that Carol's brother-in-law, a semi-retired attorney named Harold, had helped us establish with very specific rules about disbursement, and with Harold himself named as trustee. 2 days after I left, sitting in that motel room, I opened the banking app on my phone out of habit more than anything, meaning to check the operating account balance before I called the pharmacy about a refill. Instead of the roughly $40,000 I expected to see, sitting there for emergencies and monthly expenses, the balance read $11.40. I stared at it for a long moment, the way you stare at something that doesn't make sense the first 3 times you read it, waiting for the number to rearrange itself into something you can accept. It didn't. I pulled up the transaction history, and what I found there took the floor out from under me in a way that had nothing to do with my knee. Over the previous 14 months, there had been a long, steady bleed of transfers out of that account. Not one dramatic theft, but something worse in its way, something patient. $2,200 here, $3,800 there. A wire for $11,000 labeled, in the memo field, home renovation. Another for $9,000 labeled Emma's tuition, Emma being my granddaughter, Denise and Craig's youngest, who I loved without reservation, and who, as far as I knew, was still 2 years away from even applying to college. I sat there scrolling back through 14 months of my own money, disappearing in careful, deliberate increments. Small enough, I imagine, that no single transfer would have alarmed a bank's fraud detection, and large enough that over time they had emptied an account I had trusted my daughter to help me manage. I want to tell you that my first feeling was rage. It wasn't. My first feeling was a kind of grief that felt almost physical, a hollowing out in the chest, because whatever this was, it meant that at some point, my daughter had looked at her father's savings, the money that was supposed to keep me from ever being a burden to anyone, and decided it was hers to take. The rage came later, quieter than you'd expect, and it came dressed as something closer to clarity. I didn't call Denise. I didn't call the police, not yet. What I did was call Harold. Harold Whitfield had been Carol's brother-in-law for almost 40 years, married to her older sister until her sister passed a decade ago. And in all that time, he had never once, in my experience, raised his voice or made a decision without thinking it through, 3 times. He'd handled Carol's family's small estate matters for years before I ever needed him for anything of my own, and when Carol and I set up the trust, it was his steady, unhurried competence that made both of us feel like we were doing something responsible instead of something morbid. I called him from the motel parking lot because the room felt too small to hold what I needed to say, and I told him everything. The porch, the comment about a full-time job, the note on the kitchen counter, the $11.40. Harold was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then he said, "Walter, I need you to listen to me carefully, and I need you to not do anything for the next 48 hours, except rest that knee and let me look into something." I asked him what he meant. He said, "When you and Carol set up the trust, we built in a provision, one you may not fully remember because it seemed like a formality at the time, that required annual reporting on any accounts linked to trust distributions, including the operating account, specifically because Carol was worried, even then, about exactly this kind of situation happening to either of us one day. I hadn't remembered that provision. I remembered signing a great many pages that day, trusting Carol's instincts and Harold's competence in equal measure. And apparently, one of those pages had been Carol, 5 years before she died, quietly building a tripwire for a situation she must have sensed, in some part of her, was possible. I spent the next 2 days in that motel room, icing my knee, ordering food I didn't taste, and waiting. Harold called back on the 3rd day and asked if he could come see me in person rather than discuss it over the phone. He drove 2 hours from Cincinnati and sat across from me at the small round table by the window, and he laid out, in the careful language of a man who has delivered difficult news for a living, exactly what he had found. The $800 and some thousand in the trust itself was untouched, protected by exactly the kind of ironclad structure Carol had insisted on. But the operating account, the one Denise had helped me set up, the one she was a joint signer on, told a different story once Harold pulled a full accounting. It wasn't just Denise's name on those transfers. Several of the larger ones, the $11,000 for home renovation, another for $18,000 2 months later, had gone directly toward paying down a home equity line of credit that Craig had taken out against their house without Denise's knowledge, according to records Harold was able to access through channels. I won't pretend to fully understand, but that a man who spends his semi-retirement doing exactly this kind of forensic work apparently has access to. Craig had gotten himself into serious trouble with a business investment 2 years earlier, a friend's restaurant venture that had failed within 18 months, and he had been quietly bleeding my account to keep his own head above water, using Denise's access without her full knowledge of where the money was actually going, telling her, when she asked, that it was for things like Emma's activities or house repairs, small enough lies that she hadn't thought to question them closely, because why would she question her own husband? I sat with that for a long time after Harold left. It didn't erase what Denise had done, because whatever Craig's role in it, she had still been the one with her hand on the account, still been the one who hadn't looked closely enough at where her father's money was actually going, still been the one, on that porch, who hadn't stood between her husband and me when it mattered most. But it changed the shape of my anger. It gave it a second target, and in some ways, a clearer one. I called my grandson, Danny, Denise's oldest, 22, and finishing up a degree in accounting 2 hours away, not to involve him in the money directly, but because I needed to hear a voice in that family that I still trusted without complication. Danny had always been quieter than his sister Emma, more likely to sit with me in the garage while I fixed something than to ask for anything. He picked up on the second ring, said, "Grandpa, what's wrong?" in the tone of a young man who has learned to read trouble in the register of an old man's voice. I told him some of it, not all of it, just that I'd left his parents' house, and that there was a financial matter I needed to sort out. He was quiet for a second, and then he said something that told me everything I needed to know about which parts of that family had kept their footing and which hadn't. He said, "Grandpa, is this about the account?" My stomach turned over. I asked him what he meant. He said, "A few months ago I helped Mom with something on the computer, and I saw a transfer that didn't look right, and when I asked her about it, she said not to worry about it, that it was complicated, and I let it go, because it wasn't my business, but I've felt sick about it ever since." He'd been carrying that for months, a 22-year-old boy sitting on a piece of knowledge too heavy for him to know what to do with. I told him it wasn't his fault, and I meant it, and I told him I would handle it. I asked him to keep it between us for now, and he agreed, though I could hear in his voice how much it cost him to keep quiet. I moved out of the motel 8 days after I'd left, not back to Denise's house, but to a small furnished apartment near the printing warehouse I used to own, in a building where an old friend of mine, a woman named Ruth, who had worked in my accounting department for over a decade before I sold the business, happened to still manage the leasing office. Ruth had been at Carol's funeral. Ruth had also, 20 years ago, been the one who taught me how to read a balance sheet without panicking, and something about being near people who remembered who I was before all of this felt like solid ground under a leg that no longer trusted the floor. Denise found out where I was through Danny, who I hadn't sworn to secrecy about my location, only about what I knew. She showed up at the apartment on a Sunday afternoon, alone, without Craig, and stood in the doorway looking smaller than I remembered her looking in years. She said, "Dad, please, just talk to me." I let her in. We sat at the small kitchen table, and I asked her, calmly, to walk me through every transfer she remembered making out of the operating account over the last year. I watched her face while she talked, watched her list off things that matched almost exactly the innocent explanations Craig had apparently given her. The tuition fund that didn't exist yet, the renovation that, when I later confirmed with a contractor friend, had never actually been performed on their house. Somewhere in the middle of her own explanation, I watched her hear herself for the first time. I watched the color leave her face as the pattern she'd never stepped back far enough to see clicked into place in real time in front of me. I didn't yell at her. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the father explodes, and that's not what happened, and it's not who I am. What I did was ask her one question. I asked her, "When Craig told you money was needed for renovations, did you ever see the invoice?" She sat with that question for a long time, and then she put her face in her hands and said, "No, just no." That was the whole answer, and it was enough. I told her what Harold had found. I watched 38 years of being her father collide with the last 2 years of being an afterthought in her house, and I watched her try to hold both of those things at once and fail. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't fully decided, but that I knew 2 things for certain. The first was that I was not moving back into that house. The second was that Craig was going to have to answer for what he'd done, in whatever form that answer needed to take. The confrontation with Craig happened 9 days after I'd left, on a Thursday afternoon, and it happened the way Harold had planned it, not the way I might have chosen if I'd been thinking with my temper instead of my head. Harold had, over the previous week, quietly and legally assembled a complete accounting, bank records, the fabricated invoice for the renovation that never happened, the timeline matching the failed restaurant investment to the exact months the transfers had started, and a letter, notarized, laying out Walter Reeves' options going forward, which included, but were not limited to, a civil suit for recovery of funds and a report to the bank's fraud department regarding unauthorized use of joint account access. Harold sent a colleague of his, a woman named Patricia, who did this kind of work professionally, to deliver the folder to Craig's door on a weekday afternoon while Denise was still at her office and the kids were at school. I wasn't there. I'd asked Harold to let me hear about it after, because some things a father doesn't need to watch happen in real time to know they're right. Patricia told him, calmly and without accusation, that Mr. Reeves was prepared to pursue restitution through whatever legal means were necessary, and that the choice of how public or private this became was, for now, still in Craig's hands. She left the folder with him and left. Craig called Denise at work within 10 minutes. Denise called me within 20. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. And when she finally got the words out, they weren't what I expected. She said, "Dad, he's out on the porch. He won't come inside. I don't know what to do." I told her, gently, that I thought this was between her and her husband, and that I would be available to talk with either of them once things had settled, but that I wasn't going to rescue anyone from a conversation that was 14 months overdue. What I learned later, mostly from Denise, and some of it from Danny, who'd come home that weekend and seen the aftermath firsthand, was that Craig sat on that porch for almost 2 hours before he came back inside, and when he did, he told Denise everything: the restaurant investment, the mounting debt, the months of small transfers he'd asked her to help facilitate under one pretense or another, and the shame, he said, of not knowing how to tell either of them the truth once he'd started. It didn't excuse what he'd done. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a temptation in stories like this to let understanding slide into forgiveness before forgiveness has been earned. But it did explain the shape of it, and in its own way, it made the whole thing sadder rather than simpler. I met with Denise and Craig together 3 weeks later at Harold's office, with Harold present, not as a courtroom, but as a kind of structured conversation neither of us could have managed alone in a kitchen. I told Craig, directly, that I wasn't interested in destroying him, that I had no desire to see my grandchildren's father go to prison or lose his job over this, but that I expected full restitution on a payment schedule Harold would draw up, with legal weight behind it, and that going forward, I would never again be a joint signer or an unwitnessed source of funds for anyone in that family, including Denise. I told Denise separately that I loved her, that I understood grief and pressure could make people look away from things they should have examined more closely, but that trust, once spent carelessly, doesn't refill itself just because time passes. I told her it would take longer than either of us wanted. The repayment plan was modest, structured over 4 years, because Craig's income wasn't large enough to make it faster without bankrupting the household entirely, and bankrupting my own daughter's household wasn't a form of justice I was interested in pursuing. Harold structured it as a formal promissory note, with interest, filed properly, the kind of document that meant if the payments stopped, I had recourse without having to have another difficult conversation at a kitchen table. I moved most of what remained of the operating account, and eventually a portion of the trust income Harold and I agreed I could safely draw without disturbing its long-term protections, into a new account that only I could access. With a young, sharp-eyed banker at a credit union, Ruth recommended, a woman who called me by name and asked after my knee every time I came in, which is a small thing, but small things had become, by then, the things I noticed most. I want to tell you about Danny here, because he matters to how this story ends. In the months that followed, it was Danny who drove the 2 hours from his college most weekends to check on me, who sat with me in Ruth's building's little courtyard while I did the physical therapy exercises I'd been assigned, counting reps out loud in a voice that reminded me, more than I ever told him, of his grandmother's patience. It was Danny who, without me asking, started managing a simple monthly budget spreadsheet for me, not because he doubted my mind, but because he said it would help him practice for his accounting certification, which was a kindness dressed up as a favor to himself, the same kind of thing Carol used to do. I made him a small trustee alongside Harold on a portion of the estate, not out of guilt over what his mother had done, but because he had shown me, in the quietest possible ways, exactly what it looks like when someone chooses to actually see you instead of managing around you. Emma, my granddaughter, was 15 through most of this, and largely shielded from the details by her parents, though children that age know more than adults give them credit for. She started coming with Danny on some of his visits toward the end of that year, awkward and unsure at first, the way teenagers are around difficult family history they've only heard pieces of, and then, slowly, less awkward, until one Saturday she asked if I would teach her how the old printing presses worked, because she was doing a school project on manufacturing history, and she remembered, vaguely, visiting the warehouse as a little girl. I spent an entire afternoon with her at the small museum exhibit the regional company had put together using some of my old equipment, watching her ask real questions instead of polite ones, and something in my chest loosened that had been tight since a Tuesday morning, 11 months earlier, when I'd misjudged a step in the dark. Denise and Craig are still married. I want to say that plainly, because I know some of you listening are going to want a cleaner ending than that. A marriage that collapses under the weight of what it deserves. But that's not what happened, and I've stopped believing that the neatest ending is always the truest one. What happened instead is slower and less satisfying to describe. Craig has made every payment on time for the year and a half since the agreement was signed. He got a second job on weekends, at a hardware store, of all places, which I understand he's surprisingly good at. Something about actually enjoying working with his hands after years behind a desk. Denise calls me every Sunday now, not out of guilt, or at least not only out of guilt, but because somewhere in the wreckage of that year, she seemed to remember that I was her father and not merely an obligation to be scheduled around a golf game. I don't know if I fully trust either of them again in the way I once did. I've told her as much, honestly, more than once. She's told me she understands, and that she's not asking me to pretend otherwise, only to let her keep showing up and see what it adds up to over time. I've decided that's a fair enough arrangement for now. I still live in the apartment near the old warehouse. I've thought about buying a small house of my own again. Something with a porch and enough yard for a garden the way Carol used to keep one, and Ruth tells me there's a place 2 streets over that just went up for sale. Small, single story, easy on a knee that still complains on cold mornings. I think I'll go look at it next week. I think Carol would have liked that I waited this long to be ready, instead of running straight back into another house before I'd had the chance to sit quietly and figure out who I was without her, and without being anyone's line item either. People ask me sometimes, usually in the comments on stories like this one, whether I regret giving Denise access to that account in the first place, whether I regret trusting anyone with anything after what happened. I don't. Not entirely. I regret not looking closer, sooner. I regret mistaking convenience for safety. And I regret, more than anything, that it took a cracked kneecap and $11.40 in a checking account to make me finally ask the questions I should have been asking for over a year. But I don't regret Carol's instinct, all those years ago, to build a trust with a tripwire in it that neither of us ever expected to need. I don't regret Harold's patience, or Danny's honesty, or the quiet, steady rebuilding of something with my daughter that isn't what it used to be, but might, given enough Sundays, become something worth having again. If there's a lesson in this, and I've come to believe there usually is, even in the parts of our lives we'd rather not examine too closely, it's this. Love doesn't require you to stop paying attention. The people who ask for your trust because they love you are not the same as the people who deserve to keep it unquestioned forever. A father can forgive his daughter and still insist on a signature. A man can miss his wife every single day and still be grateful, she thought, years before either of them needed to, about the version of him that might one day need protecting from the people closest to him. I'm 68 years old. I built a business with my hands and lost the woman I loved to a disease that didn't care how carefully we'd planned our lives. And somewhere in the middle of grieving her, I let myself become smaller in my own family than I should have allowed. I'm working on not doing that again. If this story found something true in you tonight, I'd be glad to know it. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if any part of this feels familiar, and if you'd like to sit with me again for the next one. I'll be here. Thank you, truly, for staying with me until the end of this one. It matters more than you probably know.